are in Dartmouth Crossing in Nova Scotia, and we're actually in the hotel lobby of one of our former guests that have been on this show, and it's a real pleasure to be here. And it's always fun to be in conversation with people that are doing interesting things, have done interesting things, and I can tell you we're certainly excited about our next guest. I'm Allan Dale, and with me as always my good buddy from the East End of St. John's, Gerry Carew. How are you, Gerry?
I am doing really well. As I always say I am, but I am. And I got to tell you that this one I'm really excited about. Tom, sitting here, who will introduce himself in a second, and I started working in the radio business in St. John's, Newfoundland in the early 90s. My first job, Alan, after coming out of business school. Tom was part of the management team there, and he was an impressive individual, had a lot on the go, very approachable, and I am fascinated by his journey. Had some recent health issues. We're going to get into all that, and I'll let Tom talk about it. But I'm telling you, Alan, I'm really excited about this because I feel like it's coming back to my roots. The very first sales job I ever had, this man was part of the management team.
That's excellent, Gerry. I can't wait to dive into it. Your first job in the early 90s, you were about 35 back then. Good for you, getting a job that early on.
I was doing the math myself.
Yeah, I was doing the math there too. Tom, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Thank you very much. First of all, for the invitation, and great to catch up with you both in person, because we've done this kind of virtually as a catch-up about maybe a year and a half ago. My name is Tom Ormsby. I'm currently living here in Halifax as well. And but Gerry's right. We worked together a long time ago, and I'd forgotten it was your first job out of business school. Wow.
Yeah. Not my first job, Alan. Let's clarify that.
No. You're the one
who said a few jobs. When I was in my
he said his first job.
I thought I heard that. Well,
did I? Well, yeah.
And, yeah.
He's fact-checking me.
He is indeed. Well, he should be. and my journey currently is I'm in public relations and communications. That's really where I've been the last 20 years, and it's been a great part of my career. I've been blessed to have, I think, about 3 careers. That's the best way for me to describe it. And but the PR piece has been tremendously rewarding. They've all been rewarding, but I think this is where the evolution was for me, was to end up in this particular space, okay. and I enjoy it very much.
Tom, let's go back before we get into those 3 careers. Let's go right back to the beginning. Where'd you grow up? How did you grow up?
Yeah, how and where, really different, I guess. Born in Toronto, and to Scottish parents who had immigrated to Canada. There were 4 of us, imagine now, so it was my sister, who's just about a year older than me, and then less than 2 years after me were twins. So we had 4 kids in the house, oldest was 3.
Wow.
So that's a handful for 2 shift working parents. My father was a police officer, my mother worked in healthcare as an x-ray technician in the hospitals, but we went back to Scotland actually as kids. I spent school here in Scotland, went to school in Glasgow, and which really kind of set me up for eventually coming to Nova Scotia, I think, because I've got the Scottish piece looked after. We've got Irish heritage and the rest of the family as well. So that was really interesting, going to school in Scotland for a year. That was quite unique. Back to Canada.
How old were you then when you were?
6 turning 7 or 7 turning,
wow.
Okay.
6 turning 7.
Pretty young, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah, and that was, still had inkwells on the desks, oh yeah, the roll-up chalkboard. We still had milk before Margaret Thatcher killed the milk program, apparently, in the UK. We used to get milk every recess. It was mandatory, you couldn't get out. So now as an adult, I wonder about the poor kids who might have been lactose intolerant or something,
right.
Or dairy issues, but yeah, that was quite unique, going to school in Scotland. 9 of us living in a 2-bedroom flat with my grandparents and one of my aunts. 2 bedrooms, 9 people.
Wow.
Yeah. No fridge, we never fridge, but we had a pantry in the corner and a hole in the wall to keep the cold air coming into the pantry. Grandmother used to go down to the market every day, and it was quite a unique experience. And the 4 Canadians in the tenement, right?
What precipitated that move back to Scotland from Toronto?
My dad developed asthma when he came to Canada, and like many would have assumed, I guess, back then, it was the climate. We're talking the 50s. He'd done his time in the British Army. He'd done actually more than his national service requirement, and then he came to Canada, became a police officer. And he developed asthma, and then so, he said, well, maybe I need to go back. Maybe it's just the climate here is just in the cold, even today. God love me, he's 86, and both parents are doing well. They're both 86.
In Canada, they're living,
and they still, they're still active, but the cold still gets to him.
Right.
So move back. and brought us all with us, right? My first airplane was Toronto to Glasgow, Prestwick, I guess, airport, and that was our adventure. One suitcase, we sold everything. You know, whatever we had was in one suitcase.
That's a big upheaval for a young family, isn't it?
No kidding, yeah. My brothers were just about kindergarten age, maybe, you know. Yeah, it was quite, it was good. And I got the classic old person tale. It was literally a 2-mile walk to school, because that's the school my aunt taught at. So we had to walk with her to school and then back again every day. And she eventually became a headmistress, that she's retired now as well. But it was quite a unique adventure for sure. And you know, culturally it was different as well. But we went back, and then I think when my dad got there, he realized health was not climate driven. Mm-hmm. And then I have to guess, you know, we never had that kind of conversation, but I assume he probably just recalled all the reasons why he wanted to be in Canada. And so my father eventually came back to his job. He'd taken a leave from the police force,
right,
and had come back. And then we kind of had to finish what we were doing school-wise and stuff. And then we all came back as a family.
You come to Canada, you go back, then you come back to Canada.
Yeah, that was the route. Yeah, so, and that was it. But as a young man, I came down to Newfoundland and on a vacation, and decided, well, I liked it, you know. So I applied for a job at VOCM, you know, and got it. And so I was like, oh, I guess I'm moving to Newfoundland now, and been kind of transient ever since.
That was an on-air job, was it? The first job?
It was news and sports, and a lot of legends in Newfoundland broadcasting. Many have passed on that I've worked with, but you know, Mike Critch, you know, who you see if you watch Son of a Critch.
Yep.
Mark, who I've known since he was 10 years old, and you would know where Mark lived. They lived in the house right across the lawn. I remember Mark cutting the grass, and so Mark's playing his dad in that show.
Right.
And I worked with his father, Mike Sr., and I worked with his brother as well, as you would have as well. You know, we had you know, George McLaren. You know, there were just so many legends.
Jerry Phelan.
Jerry Phelan. Oh, you know what? Jerry was and is. He's still a good friend. We still stay in touch. But Jerry was a tremendous influence on me. He really taught me the news side of the business, and great as a mentor and a coach. You know, he really did get me to understand the business. And it was a tremendous learning. I was lucky to work for such good people.
Well, I'm going to say this, Alan. I was 100% commission salesperson, and Tom, part of the management team. The people at that station molded me, and it sustained a 30-year business development career for me. Talk about Elmer Harris.
Yes.
Oh my Lord.
Funny, I was thinking of Elmer just the other day myself.
Yeah. Incredible individual.
Yeah. You talk about complete and absolute decorum. The gentleman never ruffled. You know, he was a complete, under control, thoughtful person the entire time, which was great because we were such a run and gun industry. In, you know, and news was what we fed our listeners, right? That was kind of the core of VOCM. It was the guaranteed news station, and so you know, was whatever was going, we were going at 100 miles an hour down the road with our hair on fire. And Elmer was just, you know,
calm.
You got it. He was the great yin to the yang, right?
How long has it been, Tom, since you've been on the air at VOCM? Because you went by Tommy O, correct?
Yeah, Brian Rogers gave me that name. I didn't start that way.
That wasn't for the news, though, was it?
No.
That was a show.
I was doing it. No, I was doing it as news. I was a news person. But Brian Rogers, who was another great pro in the booth, what a pro. I learned so much from Brian how to prepare to be on air. And Brian, for some reason, just stumbled on my last name, which is not difficult. It's 6 letters, and you pronounce every one in order.
Say it for us.
Ormsby. But people hear all sorts of versions of that somehow when it comes out. And Brian kept stumbling on it, and when he would introduce me for the news. And so he said, okay, he even said, coming up is Tommy O. So he kept saying it. Then other people on the station would introduce me as that, coming up as Tommy O. And then eventually I was transferred out to Carbonear, Newfoundland, which was about 90 minutes from St. John's. It was the second largest station we had in the network, to become the morning person, and which was another great experience for sure. And people there used to use my name on air as well. They would call me Tommy O, and I kept using my own name.
Right.
And then one day, I was at an event, and there was a wonderful lady, Doss Mercel from Harbor Grace. And it was a sports event, and she was probably in her 80s at that point, and she was what's this lovely woman, great career. You know, she was getting inducted for her time playing tennis in Cuba in like 1930s or something. It was unique.
Yeah.
And I remember, what a wonderful woman. And I introduced myself, and I had my VLCM red jacket on, my blazer, and she said, "Oh, do you know Tommy O?" And I already introduced myself as Tom Ormsby. And she said, "Do you know Tommy O?" And I'm like, well, actually, that's what they call me. And that was the day I said, I have to surrender. I'm going to I have to stop using my own name because no one else was. And that stuck for all these years. Even people I run into today, maybe 30 years later, still, that's what they'll call me. And anyone in Newfoundland who knows me, they'll call me Tommy.
So you haven't been on the air with Tommy O in...
over 20 years. 20 years at least.
I know Alan's dying to ask some
Well,
questions.
there's a lot of questions in there, Tom. So, or Tommy O. What do you want to go by here today?
Well, it's funny, my family calls me Tommy.
Yeah.
Unless they introduce me to somebody, then they call me Tom.
Yeah.
Because my dad is Tom, and his dad was Tom. So to my Scottish family, I'm Young Tom.
Okay.
Right? So I'm all of them, right?
You're everything. Okay, Young Tom.
Yeah.
Let's go back to Young Tom for a second. What was it about Newfoundland? You said you vacationed there and then you applied for a job. Tell me about what you found in Newfoundland back then that made you want to be there.
Well, it was just, for me, I had friends in Newfoundland at the time, and it was just a place that I had, I was there and I enjoyed it, but I was also looking for work, for broadcasting work, and I was working kind of part-time in Toronto in radio at the time. CKMW it was called then. It had a series of on-air names. It was a sister station to CFNY, which is known now as The Edge in Toronto.
Right.
Very alternate rock and things like that. And everyone always said, if you're looking for a real full-time gig to get your foot in the door, you got to go east.
Okay.
And so that was part of it, right? It was just heading east to try to land somewhere. It's like going north.
You got your foot in the door and stayed there, what, 20 years?
Oh, yeah.
Maybe more.
It was about 20, but I think 19, I think. Yeah.
You'd be the first fellow from Toronto to move to Newfoundland to get a job. Right? Because normally, back then, of course, there's a big influx of people from Newfoundland moving to Toronto and further west, right, looking for work. So that was your first big gig then in broadcast?
Full-time broadcast. Full-time salary broadcasting.
Right.
Because I'd been doing part-time broadcasting in Toronto. And we call it stringer work. They need someone to go to the Blue Jays games and stuff, which was, that was awesome because that was when the Jays were just getting going. I remember covering this rookie named George Bell, who's now in the Hall of Fame, I think. Right. So I was doing those kind of gigs, but I wanted full-time. I knew I wanted to be related to sports in a career, and a sports broadcaster was certainly something that appealed to me. My sister was a world-class sports writer. She recently retired, and she's still actually writing now, even though she's retired. And so I thought, well, broadcasting, that appeals to me. And back then, they kind of had to get your foot in the door somehow. There was very few broadcasting schools and degree or diploma granting institutions. Right.
And so did you go down one of those paths academically?
I did a part-time course at Ryerson. At the time, it was called Ryerson Polytechnical Institute before it even became a university. Right. And I did writing for radio and television.
Okay.
And that's how I got hired into the part-time role in Toronto, and then eventually the role in Newfoundland.
So thinking back to that small academic experience that you had, how long was the program?
Oh, it was a one-year part-time.
A one-year part-time program. Thinking back to that now and all of the different communication programs that are offered today in colleges and universities, how different was it back then? What kind of things are they teaching?
Well, this was specific to writing.
Okay.
Right. So, for example, if you want to put a storyboard together for, a television show that's 22 minutes long, or or a movie, and kind of teaching how to write for that, and then how to write for the ear. And I think, for me, that was tremendously helpful because that's how my PR writing is. I write for the ear. I can still write, because I write a lot of speeches.
Right.
Well, I have written a lot of speeches for CEOs and others that I've had to work with. Even for myself, I've had to do presentations. And that learning how to write for the ear was really, really important. And I didn't know how valuable it was going to be throughout the rest of my career. Because I've got some people who are brilliant writers of technical documents and things. You've got to put it into a 3-minute speech.
Just let me ask about that. We've actually last night talked to someone about communications, and we're fascinated by it. Writing for the ear. You're actually sitting there writing. Do you then read it out to see if it flows properly? Like, how do you do this?
That's the right way to do it. But you start. It's funny when I'm writing for someone, I hear their voice and their cadence in my head.
Interesting. Oh, okay.
So you see the memes pop up in your social media feed, and there's a picture of Morgan Freeman, and there's some kind of meme, and you're literally hearing it in his voice as you read it. And so when I'm writing to say, okay, is this for Jerry? Is this for Alan? Is this for me? Is this for who? And what's their style? And so as I write, obviously we've got some messages that we need to make sure get communicated across and heard and hopefully digested with the audience. And so that's what it's about, is what message am I trying to write? How can I get that message out based on the person and the format? You know, is it a panel? Is it someone who's going to be reading right from the podium? Are they doing a presentation? But I'm generally trying to, can I break this down so the person who has the least amount of knowledge in this field still can understand it? And then also trying to write in a way to bring the person with you to the message. And I say that not to influence them, but not to scare them. Mm-hmm. If you start with, because I've been involved in 2 mine closures, having to put tools down for 2 mines. Wow. And one of them was instant, like told them that moment. And if you want them to hear what you're saying, you've got to make sure you take out trigger words that are going to put fear into them, or get them to stop thinking, or stop hearing, and all of a sudden their mind goes 1,000 places. Right. So when I'm writing, I'm trying to write for that ear, so that can you hear the message in its full and entirety, and is it clear? And that's really important, because you can put down your message on paper and hand it to somebody, but if there's something in there that's going to stop them from reading and jumping to somewhere else, you've not communicated effectively.
This is fascinating. I really find this fascinating. How does that differ for people often use the term understanding your audience or knowing your audience? That sounds a lot more sophisticated than what you're talking about there.
I guess it could be, but I think at the end of the day, it's being empathetic to whoever's you're communicating to. When I used to coach, I did a lot of media coaching for some of the executives and for my team and for supervisors who were going to be maybe at a career fair and maybe someone wanted to interview them. I always said to them, like, when you see that lens in front of you or the microphone in front of you, that's an avenue to where you want to go. Because at the end of that message, who are you trying to speak to? Is it the community members? Is it the government who's wondering why you're applying for a permit? Is it an environmental group of concern who's not sure about your proposal? And so I think the understanding of the audience is probably more about recognizing who the audience is, and then maybe recognizing their knowledge in the subject matter. I'll give you a really good example, if I may. So I've had the pleasure of working with a lot of Indigenous communities as partners across Canada. And when we started one of the mines I got involved in, we were building the first diamond mine in Ontario. There was no Cree word for diamond, and there was no Cree word for haul truck. And so that's kind of understanding your audience. There's no sense me going in and doing a brilliant presentation if I'm going to use a bunch of words that they can't translate. Wow. Because it's going to land. So we had to work with the community and with their top I want to say their top translators who could really navigate both worlds and come up with a dictionary that could be acceptable to those. And so that's kind of understanding your audience, right? To be an effective communicators. No sense talking about haul trucks and diamonds and cutoff points, and if they're looking at you like, it's just blank stares if they don't understand the words.
But I'm still trying to grasp what you're saying here. I've never thought about this. You still have to convey the idea of a diamond.
Oh, yes.
Explain to me how you did that.
Well, it was just a matter of trying to explain that inside the earth, there were certain things we were trying to retrieve. And the way we would do it would be having to, in this particular case, dig a hole in the ground. Yeah. And then as the dirt and other pieces come out with it, we're going to run it through a facility, and we're going to separate the dirt from the material we're looking for. And that material is a diamond. Right, so they didn't have a direct translation for the word diamond in Cree, right? And I can't recall at this moment. It's my fault for not remembering. But there was a word that they could use to describe the diamond, right? And sometimes it's a longer process. Like sometimes you translate from English to French, and it seems like the translation is twice as long. We go from English to Cree. It's even longer than, because it's kind of describing everything maybe in a more wholesome way.
Fascinating, Alan, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh, it really is, right? I mean, first of all, to discover that these words that we're using aren't going to resonate. It reminds me an awful lot of, Tom, when I first joined the Navy, I remember going through training with a lot of Francophone officers, and I was a Mars officer, a naval warfare officer. There's a lot of technical terms that we were throwing around in English freely, and I knew that my Francophone friends, these words were hard enough for me to kind of get my head around, or concepts were hard enough for me. And then I was thinking, oh my God, how are these guys doing it? And then I watched these guys advance to admiral bills and things like that. And I'm thinking, remarkable, at their very foundation, we were speaking, not only was it not their language, but we were speaking our language that was hardly understandable to us.
Yes.
And we never took that into account.
Yeah.
We never acknowledged that this is going to be twice as hard for you guys to make it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And
I understand 100%.
you know, and that resonates very strongly with me. That's fantastic. Tell me this, Tom. Do you remember the best speech you ever wrote, and maybe the opposite of that?
Ooh, the best speech I wrote. I'm proud of some of them. I guess I hope I'm allowed to be proud of things. Pride's a sin, right? But there was one that I wrote not too long ago, actually, a few years ago, when we were introducing a new project concept for a mine that we were intending. We had purchased a property in Nunavut, actually, sorry, and we wanted to mine it completely differently. We wanted to reduce the environmental impact to almost zero. We wanted to change the way that we were working with communities to provide benefits, because we found over the years of trial and error and working together that some community benefits work this way, and so we had to put a whole new concept on the table. And we talked about minimal environmental footprint, minimal power use, no GHG, almost a carbon neutral project. And it was introduced at a technical conference, actually, in Ontario, and it was for the CEO of the time. And I wrote it for him. We worked over the concept and what were the key messages and things. He got a standing ovation at the end of it. Yeah. And I was proud of that one because it was a concept that the mining industry in our country had not ever tried.
Yeah.
Now, we, at that point, still hadn't tried it, but that was our project intent. So that one went over really strong. We got a lot of requests. Can you come speak in Australia? Can you come speak and talk about this mining concept? We just wanted to change the classic, bring in as many trucks as you can and put this giant hole in the ground to, can we make this little tiny little hole and still maximize everything for the community? It may not come across and right now is the way it did, because it was quite a long speech, but a standing ovation at the end by the audience, and so that was.
Now give me the opposite of that. What's one that you go back and say?
No names.
No names. You don't have to give names.
It was because it wasn't that they were really bad. It was that I didn't know my speaker.
By the way, before you go into this, we're called Gale Force Wins, but we discovered Gale Force adversity leads to wins. So with that,
so what do they say?
Finish your story.
Calm waters never made a good sailor.
That's right.
So there were two, and it was the same thing. It was a general manager from one of the mines I was working with, and actually it was also the president and CEO of the company. Separate events, but same thing. I need a speech, right? I need a speech. Yeah. All right. So what? Okay.
And how much time were you given to make this happen?
Enough.
Okay.
That part's okay.
So we can't blame them for giving you short window.
No. So I wrote them each separate speeches, and they loved it. And then I heard them, and I'm watching them boot these things all over, and I'm like, what? And so what it was, I didn't realize, and my fault maybe for not asking, that they like to ad-lib.
Right.
As a habit. I didn't write these to be ad-libbed. I wrote these, we agreed on messages. They read them, and said, proofed and signed off on them, and then I watched them deliver them going, oh, this is a train wreck going on here. And so at the end, and the general manager at the time, he actually confessed afterwards and apologized. He said, you probably noticed I like to ad-lib. I went, yeah. And with the president and CEO, we had the same thing. I said, okay, and I'm not going to name his full name, Jim, but you know who you are. And he's still a good friend today. Yeah. And so we had to, so for his, it was the same thing. Because he was all over the place. He wanted to ad-lib. So we had to agree on a couple things. Here's your introduction. Yep. Read it as is, because there's guests you want to acknowledge, or we're going to acknowledge we're on traditional lands, or whatever the appropriate introduction should be. And then there's going to be appropriate exit. And then these are the bullets in here.
Themes.
You must hit these bullets in this order. You can talk to them any way you want, but these bullets, these are the things that we must communicate to the audience.
Right. And around this time last year, we were lucky enough to get a tour of the Halifax shipyard.
That's right. That's how you and I reconnected. Yeah.
It was, I'm just getting goosebumps because I had never, you're comfortable with big things. I mean, I spent 30 years doing advertising. I'm proud of Irving, frankly. It might sound weird to say that, but it's incredible. Pieces of steel, the equipment that's needed to make this move, it's incredible.
Well, it is incredible, right? And the whole national ship procurement strategy, whether it's Irving or Davie or C-SPAN, this whole shipbuilding industry springing alive in our country again, which, quite frankly, it had tailed off for many years.
Well, when we delivered Harry DeWolf, it was the first Navy combat ship been delivered in 25 years.
Right.
Now, it's part of the combat package, you know, so people should, it's an Arctic and offshore patrol ship. It's got a very tremendous function. It's going to be probably one of the most versatile type of ship in the Navy's history.
Right.
But it's the first time they'd had a ship like that delivered in over 25 years, and it was the largest one.
Yeah.
It was the largest one as well. And the great thing about building ships at home, I used to have to deal with the regular, traffic on your social media channel stuff saying, it's all too expensive. And for every dollar invested in Canadian shipbuilding, domestically, it generates 3. Or you can take that dollar and send it offshore and never see it again.
Right.
Right. And so it's doing a lot of things, right? And it's bringing a lot of people into the shipbuilding industry, which, to your point, had kind of gone pretty stagnant for a while in Canada on that large, important scale. And as we can see, the events around the world now, I mean, we do have to do our part in the defense world.
Yeah.
And the climate change now, access to the Arctic is going to be huge. I mean, you've got countries that some are not even polar countries building polar icebreakers for some reason, because they're planning on heading up there. So it's a really interesting industry to be in, and I almost 3 years with the shipyard.
So there you go. So you talk about service being all around you, but service was, you were serving right there in that moment. So thank you for that. So Gerry and I had the privilege of sailing on Toronto, which a ship, actually another ship built by Irving Shipyard, but that was built in New Brunswick. St. John, New Brunswick. So we had the privilege of sailing from St. John's, Newfoundland, back to Halifax, went on board a ship of a tour of the Margaret Brook, and then walked in the back of the Irving Shipyard where the steel was coming in one end and ships were coming out the other end.
That's exactly how it works.
Right, and it was impressive like you wouldn't believe. We were excited to meet you that day because we had been in communication on LinkedIn and the like. You weren't there that day. Where were you?
You went dark for some reason.
Yeah. I was lying in a coma in the Halifax infirmary.
So take us there.
Wow, it's interesting. I've said this to others. COVID probably saved my life, and I don't think anyone expects those words in the same sentence.
Right.
And I had been working pretty hard at the shipyard, and I've been golfing, but I wasn't feeling well. And at the time, we're talking just over a year ago, in fact, about a year, 15 months ago. At the time, I just wasn't feeling great, and we were getting ready to deliver the Margaret Brook to the Navy. Literally, I'd done all the planning, everything else is ready to go.